For 22 years, I made sure 346 people went home safe every day. They thanked me with a cardboard box. The room smelled like fresh toner and silence, that corporate kind of silence that follows you in after the door clicks shut. Walter Hayes, 59, stood just inside the glass-walled conference room of Western Plains Manufacturing, the place where he'd spent more than 2 decades keeping the factory floor safer than most hospitals. Patricia, from HR, gave him that practiced smile that never reached her eyes, and beside her sat Leonard Wright, clean-shaven, cufflinks glinting, hands folded neatly over a spreadsheet he hadn't earned. "Walter," Patricia began, her voice dipped in that soft, sorrowful tone HR saves for corporate executions, "we're making some operational changes." Leonard chimed in like an echo of efficiency. "It's about streamlining, realigning leadership for a more agile structure." Walter didn't sit, he didn't speak. He just stared at the folder Patricia slid across the table like it was a condolence card. 2 weeks' notice, half pension now, the rest in monthly installments, a severance line that barely lasted 2 paragraphs. His replacement, Jason, 28, Oklahoma State business grad, was starting tomorrow. "Very promising," Patricia added. Walter reached for the folder, but his eyes lingered on the logo printed at the top. Newer, sleeker, colder than the one they had back when this place still smelled like steel and oil, not printers and policy. No one mentioned the 22 years. No one said thank you. No one remembered that no one ever lost a hand or finger on Walter's floor. He blinked slowly, the kind of blink that holds back more than it lets go, and said only, "I understand." Patricia smiled again. Leonard looked relieved. Outside, the Oklahoma sky had turned the color of metal shavings. Walter didn't take the freeway home. He drove the long way past the refinery ruins where his father once worked, back when men shook hands with soot on their knuckles. At a red light near the old river bridge, he glanced at his own hands. Calloused, steady, stained by years of grease and heat and discipline. He thought of Ethan, his son, now grown and living far away. Thought of Jennifer, long gone. Thought of how 22 years of doing the right thing could fit into a cardboard box. That night, he placed his boots by the front door, the ones that never quite came clean no matter how hard he scrubbed, and stared at them like they might answer the question no one in that room had the decency to ask. What happens to a man when the work that defined him is erased without ceremony? Walter stood in the hallway outside the locker room, holding the company-issued cardboard box like it weighed 100 pounds, though inside were only 3 things: a wrench with a worn grip, a photo of Clara from their first anniversary, and the stopwatch she'd given him the day he got promoted. "To keep time the way you keep promises," she'd said, and he'd smiled then, not knowing how that sentence would follow him for the rest of his life. The hum of the machines beyond the wall had a rhythm he knew like his own breath, and as he stared down the corridor where he'd walked every morning for 22 years, he could still hear the echoes of footsteps from younger days, when Ethan had just started school, and Clara would wait by the door with a thermos and a kiss on his cheek. He'd started on the factory floor back when Western Plains was still family-owned, before the mergers, before the consultants with their MBAs and efficiency charts, back when the measure of a man was whether he stayed late to fix a jammed press or showed up on weekends when the storm knocked out half the line. Back when people like him were trusted with more than numbers. Clara had always understood the gravity of that kind of pride, how he'd never missed a single safety inspection, not because the manuals told him to, but because real people counted on those systems, because behind every valve was a father's hand or a mother's back, because if something went wrong, someone went home hurt, and he couldn't live with that. Never could. When Clara got sick, he'd kept working through it, switching to night shifts so he could be with her in the day, and even then she'd told him, "Don't let go of the line just because I'm fading. You've built something honest, Walter. Don't let anyone tell you it's outdated." And now, here he was, told to train a replacement who measured success by screen time and spreadsheets, being handed a severance folder by someone who didn't know the number of bolts on the hydraulic press or how the metal swelled in July heat. But in this quiet moment, standing in the shadow of a place that once needed him, Walter didn't feel rage or despair. He just felt unfinished, like a sentence someone interrupted before the meaning could land, like a man who still believed that some things, like responsibility and dignity, weren't meant to be optimized away. He ran a hand over the photo of Clara before placing it gently in the box, her smile frozen in time, and whispered softly, "I kept my promise, darling." Every damn day, then straightened his back, stepped out into the lot, and walked into a future he hadn't asked for but wouldn't walk away from. It began with a new logo, just a slight change in font and color, but to Walter it was like watching someone repaint the front porch of the house you grew up in without asking. Then came the emails from corporate, not addressed to him by name, just team and operations. Vague memos about cost optimizations, so that didn't say anything but felt like warnings whispered between the lines. He noticed when the order for replacement hydraulic seals took 3 weeks instead of 2, when the safety meeting he'd led for 18 years was quietly moved online and turned into a pre-recorded slideshow narrated by someone in a different time zone. He noticed when the part supplier changed cheaper bolts, cheaper labels, and no one told him. It wasn't one big thing, but 1,000 small cuts that added up to a slow bleed. Leonard Wright arrived with a crisp tie and crisp emails, full of promises about modernization, but never once looked at the old mechanical schematics Walter had kept updated by hand. The man didn't ask questions, didn't walk the floor, didn't look the machines in the eye the way Walter had every day since 2001. When Walter submitted a routine request for heat sensor calibration, something that should have been automatic every quarter, it got bounced back with a note, "Not prioritized this cycle." When he asked about the drop in emergency drill funding, he got silence. Then, one day, Jason Weber showed up on the floor in spotless loafers and a tight smile, clipboard in hand, asking questions that sounded like decisions already made. Do we really need to check this valve every shift? And isn't this lockout protocol a bit conservative? Walter didn't argue, not out loud. But that night, he pulled a clean notebook from his drawer, opened to the first page, and began to document every delay in maintenance, every denied request, every change that cut corners in the name of progress. Clara used to say, "If you feel something's wrong, write it down before they talk you out of it." And he could almost hear her voice as he wrote date after date, code after code. He didn't know yet what he'd do with those notes, but he knew better than to trust people who smiled while erasing history. He kept walking the floor, kept listening to the machines breathe, but now he carried more than a wrench in his back pocket. He carried a record of what they were trying to undo, a quiet rebellion written in ink and time, and the knowledge that truth, when written carefully enough, could outlast any lie. The first time Jason referred to the team as units, something in Walter recoiled. A quiet twist in his gut like stripped threads on an old bolt. Because Diego wasn't a unit, he was a man who hadn't missed a single shift in 12 years, even when his wife was in chemo, and Alicia wasn't a data point. She was the only one who could coax the secondary press to behave in winter. But to Jason and Leonard, everyone was a row in a spreadsheet, color-coded for performance, sortable by output per hour, with no column for loyalty or experience or the sound a machine made when it was about to fail. Walter watched as they rolled out digital dashboards that pulsed on flat-screen monitors mounted above the floor, blinking red or green depending on how fast someone moved, how often they stopped, how well they conformed to metrics written by people who'd never stood in steel-toed boots for 10 hours straight. One afternoon, he saw Alicia glance up at the screen with her name on it, yellow bar hovering just under target, and he saw her flinch like she'd been slapped. That night, he added a new section to his notebook. Morale indicators, small things, facial expressions, silences where jokes used to be, break room conversations clipped short because someone was afraid of being overheard. He wrote it all down not because it would fix anything yet, but because he knew there would come a moment when they'd pretend no one noticed, and when that time came, he would have proof that they did. When Jason suggested eliminating the extra 5-minute overlap between shifts, a tradition Walter had fought for to ensure safe handoffs, Leonard approved it instantly, citing efficiency gains of 0.4%. Walter didn't argue, just quietly noted that Diego now skipped lunch to make sure the third shift knew the quirks of the number 4 press. The tension on the floor began to hum like a misaligned belt. Subtle but growing, and Walter, who'd once felt the factory breathe with him, now felt it pulling away, like a child slipping from a parent's grasp. He saw corners being cut not with malice but with ignorance, the kind that came from believing numbers told the whole truth. And yet, even as his influence waned, he remained steady, unshaken, because what they didn't understand was that he wasn't clinging to the past, he was guarding something fragile, something they couldn't see on their dashboards, the soul of the floor, the unspoken web of care and attention that had kept 346 people safe under his watch. He kept recording, kept smiling just enough, but in his mind he was sharpening every memory, every warning ignored, preparing for a reckoning not of vengeance, but of responsibility. The cold snap hit on a Monday, the kind of dry, brittle cold that made steel stutter and hydraulics wheeze, and Walter felt it the moment he stepped onto the floor, the #2 press moaning with a hesitation it never had in warmer months. The kind of subtle resistance you could only hear if you'd been listening for 20 years, but Jason didn't hear it, and Leonard didn't care. And when Walter mentioned the ambient temperature drop and the need to preheat the lubricant lines, Jason smiled and said, "The system auto-regulates now," which was technically true but practically dangerous, because what automation didn't know was that the sensor on that line had been finicky since last March and sometimes lagged by 2 full cycles, which was enough to cause a jam if the steel cooled too fast, and by noon the jam happened. Press 3 ground to a halt mid-stroke, bucking the armature and overheating the pump, triggering a floor shutdown and costing 3 full hours of production. Jason called it a glitch, but Walter knew better, and so did Diego, whose hands were still black with grease when he whispered, "That should have been preventable." The incident was logged as equipment variance, the kind of euphemism that looked harmless on reports but hid the truth that safeguards had failed because the people who knew how to protect them were no longer heard. That night, Walter sat at his kitchen table with his notes spread out like a battlefield. Dates, times, skipped procedures, altered schedules, screenshots from internal emails where maintenance requests were marked as low priority, and one photo of the jammed press taken on his old flip phone, sent grainy but undeniable. The next day, Jason introduced rotational training, a new program to cross-train operators on multiple machines to increase flexibility, but Walter saw it for what it was, de-skilling. A way to justify removing experienced specialists and replacing them with generalists who cost less and questioned nothing. Alicia was reassigned to the cutting line despite her medical note about blood sugar drops, and Diego was put on call for both shifts, which meant 16-hour days with no overtime, just comp time he'd never be allowed to use. Walter didn't argue, he documented, and in the quiet moments between shifts, he started making quiet calls. Not to lawyers, not yet, but to former colleagues, retired inspectors, old supervisors who remembered what the floor used to be, and he asked them questions like, how do you prove systemic negligence without being inside, and what does it take to trigger a third-party audit? And though most were cautious, one gave him a name, Helen Barnes, State Safety Board, firm but fair, and Walter wrote it down in the corner of his notes, underlined twice, because winter had come to the factory, not just the weather, but the kind that settles in when people stop listening to the right voices, and he knew it was time to prepare for a storm of his own making. The next week brought a string of tiny failures that to anyone else might have seemed like coincidence, but to Walter they were warnings. First, it was the emergency stop on the North Assembly line that took 3 full seconds longer to activate than it should have, enough to nearly catch a loose cuff of one of the new hires who didn't even know what to listen for, and then it was the backup power checks that Jason declared non-essential for the quarter, even though Walter knew the capacitor banks were overdue for calibration by 6 months. And when he raised the issue in a quiet conversation outside the break room, Jason smiled and said, "We're shifting priorities to what moves the numbers," which sounded like business but felt like betrayal, because Walter remembered the day Ethan was born and how he'd missed the delivery because of a late shift, all for the sake of making sure the floor ran safely. And now the same place he'd sacrificed for was turning safety into a line item that could be slashed. Like it wasn't lives but percentages they were managing. That night, he couldn't sleep, so he pulled out his old hard drive, the one he used to back up reports when the company changed data systems 2 years ago, and began compiling everything. The shift logs, maintenance overrides, missed inspections, staff reassignments that violated internal policy, all marked and indexed. It wasn't that he didn't trust anyone, it was that he no longer trusted the system to protect anyone. Even Diego, who once laughed off pressure from management, had started speaking softer, looking over his shoulder more, and Alicia's hands shook when she punched in her time card last Thursday, as if the job itself was eroding her confidence piece by piece. Walter saw it happening, not just to the machines, but to the people. The floor that once felt like family now fractured into silence and glances, everyone afraid to say what they felt, or worse, pretending not to feel anything at all. He knew then that the damage wasn't just mechanical, it was moral, and unless someone stood up, someone who knew where the old lines were drawn before they were blurred, it would keep spreading. And so he kept his voice low but his notes thorough, kept his steps slow but his eyes sharp, because trust was fading and corners were folding, and in a place where no one wanted to say what they knew, Walter became the one who remembered everything. Walter didn't plan to sit near the supervisors that day, but the cafeteria was more crowded than usual, and Diego had waved him over to the only empty seat near the microwaves, and as soon as he sat down, he noticed Leonard Wright across the room, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled perfectly, and that ever-present look like he was about to rebrand the floor into a Silicon Valley showroom. Jason was sitting beside him, nodding too often, his lunch untouched. His shirt pressed but damp at the collar, and Walter caught only fragments of their conversation. Reducing inspections, new metrics, no pushback from legal, and for a moment, he thought about standing up and saying something, anything. But then, Diego leaned over and whispered, "They cut the coolant line checks this week." Said it's temporary. You know damn well nothing good happens when coolant doesn't circulate, and Walter just nodded slowly, biting into his sandwich like it was the only thing keeping him from saying what he really felt. Across the table, Alicia stirred her soup, eyes locked on nothing, until she said without looking up, "I had to skip Alicia's doctor's appointment yesterday. I don't trust that kid they put on the floor. She missed a torque reset last shift." And again, Walter said nothing, because he knew silence had become the unofficial dress code at Western Plains. He'd watched this culture shift happen before, slowly at first, like a hallway getting colder day by day, and now it was so cold, people didn't even notice they'd stopped speaking up. Until something broke. Until someone bled. Later that day, in the locker room, Jason caught him by the vending machines, his voice low but tense. "Listen, I didn't ask for this job to gut your protocols. I'm just doing what they're telling me," and Walter studied the young man's face, not arrogant now, just tired and cornered, and replied, "That's the problem. You think you were hired to lead, but all they needed was someone who wouldn't fight back," and Jason's jaw clenched like he wanted to argue but couldn't, because he knew Walter was right. The worst part wasn't that people were being replaced, it was that what they stood for was being erased, rewritten in jargon and spreadsheets until no one remembered what the old floor felt like when it was built on trust, not targets. Walter walked out of the break room slower that day, not because his legs hurt, but because he was carrying a new weight, the knowing, the seeing, the being the last one left who could still name the cracks in the foundation before someone else got crushed under them. That night, Walter sat at his kitchen table with the same yellow legal pad he'd used for years. First for shift rosters, later for maintenance logs, and now for something he couldn't name just yet, only that it felt necessary. The numbers didn't lie. They never had. Not when he was 28 and learning from old Jack how to time a hydraulic cycle to the half-second. Not when he'd first taught Diego how to chart temperature drift across machines that didn't have sensors yet. And certainly not now, as he laid out the accident-free calendar for the past 6 years, side by side with the new production logs Jason had forwarded for review. And already Walter spotted them. Inconsistencies in the maintenance intervals, fewer safety sign-offs per week, anomaly reports marked closed without any accompanying work orders. Like someone had taught the system to look fine on paper, even as the floor weakened beneath their feet. He highlighted 2 entries, both referencing the No. 3 press, one noting a leak, the other a vibration anomaly logged by Alicia and closed 2 days later without parts being ordered. And as he traced the timeline with his pen, his gut turned. In the old system, that would have triggered a shutdown and 2-man inspection. Now it was brushed off with a single note, operator monitor ongoing, which was corporate speak for "we'll fix it when it breaks." And Walter leaned back in his chair, staring at the page like it had said something out loud. The phone buzzed. It was Bethany from inventory, a simple text. "Have you seen the lubricant order reductions? They're using half what we did last quarter." Half, Walter thought, on the same machines under higher quotas. That wasn't efficiency, that was gambling. He opened his laptop, cross-referenced Diego's torque sensor reports with Alicia's downtime slips, and the story began to write itself. Quiet, dangerous, familiar. He remembered a summer 18 years ago when they'd skipped a pressure valve inspection to meet a deadline, and how 2 days later a clamp blew mid-shift, sending shards across the catwalk, missing Sam's knee by an inch. Walter had never let that happen again, not under his watch, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let it happen now. Not quietly, not just because his badge didn't open the front gate anymore. The numbers didn't lie. They whispered, repeated, warned, until someone finally listened, and Walter was listening now, harder than ever. By the end of that week, Walter's notes had become a second kind of blueprint. Not for equipment, but for systems, for behavior, for intent. It was in the timing of the changes, the language of the emails, the sudden reshuffling of budgets and personnel that didn't align with any operational necessity he'd ever known. And late Thursday night, staring at his monitor, it hit him. This wasn't incompetence, it was orchestration. The same phrases echoed across departments. Budget-driven decisions, agile metrics, lean restructuring, and while each sounded harmless, together they formed a pattern. One he'd seen before during the Axiom acquisition 2 years back, when the new parent company had replaced half the HR staff in 3 months, citing efficiency, only for a lawsuit to surface later involving severance abuse. Now it was the floor's turn, only this time they weren't just shedding salaries. They were weakening the backbone of the plant under the guise of progress, and what chilled him wasn't the disregard for people, he'd seen that before, but the precision of it, like someone was following a playbook. He opened the file Jason had sent him last month, the one Walter had almost deleted. An org chart labeled Phase 2, implementation, with lines not just to production but legal, compliance, and even external vendors, some of which Walter didn't recognize until he ran their registry numbers through a public database and saw the names linked back to 2 holding firms in Delaware, both connected to a larger group. Haven Ridge Capital, a known, aggressive, cost-cutting private equity fund. His eyes narrowed. Haven Ridge had been on the radar during his final year when they acquired a chain of fabrication shops in Texas and gutted their training programs within a quarter. And now, it seemed, they were circling Western Plains, maybe already had their claws in. Walter leaned back, the old floor map of the plant still hanging above his desk, a relic from the pre-merger days, and for the first time, he didn't see machines and shift patterns. He saw lines of leverage, points of pressure, gaps in oversight that someone was exploiting not by mistake, but by design. If Haven Ridge was involved, then Leonard wasn't just incompetent. He was the delivery system, the face for a deeper shift, one that would make every safety failure look like a local issue, while the real culprits moved money behind shell names. Walter scribbled one word across his notepad in bold capital letters: systematic. And beneath it, a question he couldn't shake. How many accidents would it take before someone outside the plant noticed? And who would they believe? The old foreman with a box full of memories? Or the suits with clean charts and polished lies? It was time to stop collecting data. It was time to start preparing a response. The next morning, Walter drove past the factory without stopping, slowing just enough to catch a glimpse of the loading bay where the new shipment of untested valves was being prepped. Jason stood near the bay, tablet in hand, too absorbed in data to notice the forklift swerving just slightly off path. And Walter didn't need to be there to know that 2 maintenance reports had likely gone ignored this week. He continued downtown, parked 3 blocks from the city office building, and walked the rest of the way in silence, each step calibrated like a man crossing a minefield he himself once designed. At the public library, tucked in the corner beneath the community board, he pulled out a manila envelope marked only with a simple printed label. Q1 maintenance gaps for review, and slipped it into the outgoing mail bin addressed to Helen Barnes, the same safety inspector who'd once thanked him for always being 5 steps ahead. She didn't know he was sending it, and it wouldn't arrive under his name, but it would arrive, full of timestamps, reports, falsified inspection logs, and photos from the shop floor showing rusted backup generators and lockout tags that hadn't been rotated since his departure. Next, he stopped by the cafe where Diego's cousin worked the afternoon shift. He ordered black coffee, left an envelope in the tip jar under a $50 0-cent bill, and left without a word. Inside the envelope, a copy of the same photos, plus a handwritten note. "Tell your uncle to document everything. Everything." Then he texted Russell, just 5 words. "The clock is ticking, eyes open." Walter knew this wasn't enough to stop the machine, not yet, but it would sow questions in the right places, the type that would make someone like Leonard look over his shoulder and wonder who else might be watching. It would also give Diego and Alicia the courage to start collecting, cross-checking, and quietly whispering among trusted crew. In the evening, Walter opened his laptop and created a burner email address, then scheduled 3 emails to send at staggered intervals over the next 10 days, each addressed to a different party, one to a local journalist who once covered labor reform at regional factories, another to the backup compliance officer at Meridian Energy, and the third to a private watchdog nonprofit tracking safety practices in industrial facilities owned by private equity groups. He didn't ask them to expose anything, he only asked questions, seeded doubt, attached a few numbers, a few dates, a few names. It was enough. And when he closed his laptop, he sat in the dark for a long time, the silence of his apartment, filled only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock Clara had picked out 15 years ago. The world thought he was retired, irrelevant, a footnote. But Walter knew the truth. You don't need a title to set things in motion. You just need to pull the right thread and let gravity do the rest. 3 days later, the floor began to whisper. Quiet at first, like the hum of a machine right before it ceases up. Someone in logistics mentioned that 3 crates of parts had arrived late and uninspected. Diego noticed a minor leak in the hydraulic line that had supposedly just been cleared in maintenance logs, and Russell walked into the locker room to find Alicia staring down at her checklist with an expression that didn't match her usual steel. "They skipped step 4, she muttered, not even looking up, and blamed it on me. And when she glanced at Russell, he nodded, like 2 engineers watching the first crack crawl across a dam they've both patched too many times to count. Across the plant, Jason's cheerful startup bro energy had faded, replaced with short answers, longer meetings, and circles under his eyes that no sleep seemed to erase. He kept double-checking reports, adjusting schedules, reassigning people without notice, trying to hold together something that was already buckling underneath the weight of its own shortcuts. Meanwhile, Walter's presence, though invisible, began to reemerge through patterns. Patterns only those who had worked under him would recognize. The way Diego now color-coded his logs, just like Walter used to. The way Alicia had started leaving handwritten notes in the break room with reminders that read suspiciously like Walter's phrasing. The way Russell pulled out the old red clipboard from storage that Walter had used for floor audits and began quietly logging things again. No one said his name out loud, not yet, but he was everywhere. In the way they started to trust their own observations more than Jason's emails. In the way they walked the floor with their eyes open wider. In the growing sense that someone, somewhere, had their back again. Then came the 4th equipment glitch in 2 weeks. This time, the secondary cooling fan in Bay 7 stalled out mid-shift, triggering a partial shutdown that cost the plant nearly 6 hours of lost production. Leonard called an emergency floor meeting, his voice tight, rehearsed, defensive. "We're experiencing transitional turbulence," he said, reading from a sheet, "and I want to emphasize that performance will improve once the new systems are fully in place." But the eyes watching him weren't nodding. They were quiet, calculating, skeptical, the way people look when they know the numbers don't match the noise. After the meeting, Russell pulled Diego aside and handed him a folded slip of paper. "He's watching, still," it read, and that was all Diego needed to make the decision to call Walter that night. Not to vent, not to warn, but to offer something more. "It's unraveling, Walt," he said, "and people are starting to notice who used to keep it all from falling apart." And on the other end of the line, Walter didn't say anything at first, just listened, the silence more solid than words. Finally, he said, "Good, keep the records coming," then paused. "Tell Alicia she was right to stand her ground," and then hung up, already turning back to the spreadsheet on his desk, with a strange calm in his chest. The calm of a storm that knows it doesn't need to roar to bring everything down. Jason didn't look like the same man when he stepped into the diner that evening. He traded his polished dress shirt for a rumpled hoodie, his tablet for a stack of printouts held together by a binder clip, and his usual self-assured stride had been replaced with a kind of cautious humility, the kind that comes only after a man realizes the instructions he was given don't work when machines scream and people bleed. Walter was already seated in the corner booth, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him, his eyes fixed not on Jason but on the reflection of the factory roof in the window behind him. He didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't reach across the table, and yet something in his presence said, "I'll listen, if you're honest." Jason slid into the seat across from him and exhaled. "It's worse than I thought," he said, skipping pleasantries. "Everything's barely holding together. Maintenance, morale, even the damn inventory systems keep crashing," and Walter just nodded, a slow blink his only reaction. "I tried to follow the procedures you left behind," Jason added quickly, "but Leonard said they were outdated, that we needed to move faster, streamline, cut fat." He looked down at the printouts. "But I think we've been cutting muscle, not fat," and Walter let the silence stretch just long enough to let the truth settle in the air between them like steam rising from a cracked pipe. Finally he spoke, voice low and steady. "You weren't set up to succeed," he said. "They handed you a machine that runs on care and gave you a manual about speed." And Jason's laugh was short, bitter. "No one told me that the machines had moods, or that Diego listens to vibrations like their gospel, or that Alicia needs space near her locker because of her blood sugar." He looked up then, eyes tired but clear. You didn't build a factory, you built a living system. And I've been breaking it, one blind step at a time. Walter folded his hands, fingers calloused and steady. Then stop, he said, simply. Stop pretending the plan they gave you works. Start telling the truth. And Jason nodded slowly, then reached into his folder and slid a sheet across the table. This is the maintenance denial log from the past 6 weeks. 27 requests marked deferred due to budget. 3 of them critical systems, one of which failed last week. He hesitated. And here's the kicker. I flagged 2 of them personally, and they were still overridden. Walter scanned the page with the kind of precision you don't learn in MBA programs, only on a floor where a half-second's mistake could cost someone a limb. And then he looked up, his gaze heavy. You want to fix this, Jason? He asked. Then you've got to stop being a manager and start being a witness. What you saw, what you flagged, what they ignored, it matters, but only if someone says it out loud, and Jason nodded. I'll write the statement tonight, he said, and I'll backdate every denial I have on file. He paused, then added softly, I didn't come to protect myself. I came because someone could get hurt, and I'm not sure I can carry that. And for the first time, Walter reached for his coffee, took a long sip, and then said, That's the first real thing you've said all night, son. Then looked him square in the eye. You still have time to be on the right side of this, but don't wait too long, because the floor doesn't wait, and neither does the truth. It started with a quiet ping, a notification that Walter's email, the one meticulously compiled with photographs, maintenance logs, internal memos, and Jason's freshly signed affidavit, had been successfully delivered to the inboxes of 5 key recipients: the State Industrial Safety Board, the Department of Labor, the corporate compliance team at Axiom Partners, Meridian Energy's executive counsel, and one trusted journalist from the Tulsa Tribune who'd been quietly investigating labor violations across the Midwest. Walter didn't feel triumph, not yet, just a deep, grounded sense that the gears of something bigger had finally started turning, and all he had to do now was not blink. Within hours, the ripples began. Meridian issued a sudden halt on all future orders from Western Plains, pending a third-party audit. The safety board dispatched a pre-inspection notice to the plant marked urgent, and a terse email arrived from Axiom's VP of Operations, requesting clarification of recent allegations, with attached documentation. Jason texted him just 2 words. It's happening. Walter replied only, hold the line. By midday, Alicia messaged to say that Leonard hadn't shown up to the floor meeting and that rumors were swirling. Some said he'd been reassigned, others whispered he'd been asked to take a leave of absence until further notice. But what mattered more to Walter was what Russell sent next, a forwarded email from HR marked confidential, beginning preparations for an internal review of supervisory conduct during the past quarter, triggered by external stakeholder concern. It was happening faster than even he expected. Not a collapse, but a controlled demolition of a system that had been patched with duct tape and false reports, now coming apart under the weight of its own carelessness. That evening, Walter sat at his kitchen table looking over a printed list of every employee who had messaged him since his departure. 12 names, 12 voices that chose conscience over comfort. When Helen Barnes from the safety board called, her voice was calm but edged with something almost like apology. We've received everything, she said, and I just got off the phone with Axiom. We'll be conducting an on-site investigation starting Monday, and this time, it won't be polite. Walter allowed himself a slow breath, the kind that reaches the chest and settles into the bones. Thank you, he said simply, and Helen added, for what it's worth, your documentation is the most thorough I've ever seen from a private citizen. Not a citizen, he replied, just someone who couldn't forget the sound of a press misfiring and what it almost cost Russell, then hung up. The next morning, headlines started to bloom quietly. Whistleblower alleges safety fraud at Tulsa manufacturing plant. No names, not yet, but the photo of the Western Plains sign was unmistakable, and by lunchtime, Alicia texted, media vans outside, Jason's pale as chalk. Walter didn't gloat, didn't grin, just turned off the news and went out back to tend his garden, knowing full well that seeds don't sprout under spotlights, they grow in silence, and in that silence the old rules were breaking down, not because someone shouted, but because someone had paid attention long enough to write down everything no one else wanted to admit. By the time the safety board inspectors stepped onto the factory floor, escorted by a visibly flustered interim operations lead, Walter already knew exactly what they would find, not just loose bolts or delayed inspections, but a pattern, a deliberate erosion of protocol masked by sanitized spreadsheets and half-true memos. And as he watched the live feed of local news showing their arrival, he wasn't watching with anxiety, but with quiet calculation. The night before, Jason had sent the last piece, a full recording of his Zoom meeting with corporate, in which Leonard had explicitly instructed him to delay maintenance requests unless someone bleeds. That line, transcribed in bold, was now at the top of Walter's final document batch, sent directly to Axiom's internal ethics office, with the subject line, "Escalation of known violations, timeline enclosed." Russell had also just forwarded security cam footage from 2 weeks ago showing a near accident at the loading dock, one that Jason had been pressured to omit from formal reports. It was messy, undeniable, and most damning of all, preventable. When Helen Barnes spotted Walter's name on the archived inspection request logs, she made a note to call him again, but her supervisor beat her to it. This time, not just to thank him, but to ask if he'd be willing to join their advisory board for manufacturing oversight, not as an investigator, but as a reform architect. Walter didn't say yes immediately. He wanted to see what Western Plains would do once cornered. And cornered they were. By midweek, Meridian Energy had issued a formal demand for financial restitution over failed components traced to faulty valves, threatening to cancel their $4,800,000 0 cents annual contract if immediate changes weren't made. That alone was enough to jolt Axiom into panic mode, and within 48 hours, an internal announcement was issued. Leonard Wright was stepping down, effective immediately, and Jason Weber was on administrative leave pending further review. But the domino didn't stop there. Thomas Whitfield, a senior VP from Axiom, flew in directly to meet the plant team and scheduled back-to-back interviews with floor supervisors, including Diego, Alicia, and Russell, each of whom came armed with carefully documented logs, all cross-verified by Walter. It was clinical, surgical, almost beautiful in its precision, the entire strategy Walter had spent weeks building, now unfolding like clockwork. Not because of vengeance, but because of unshakable evidence and the quiet alliance of people who still believed the factory floor was worth protecting, standing by his truck in the parking lot that afternoon, Walter received a call from an unknown number. It was Thomas himself. "Mr. Briggs," he began. "You've given us a lot to think about. We'd like to formally invite you to consult on a full operational reset, not just here, but across 3 of our sister sites." Walter didn't answer right away. He was watching the crew filter out of the building, their faces tired but alert, eyes scanning headlines, hands holding clipboards again instead of silence. This wasn't just about a broken press or a crooked executive. It was about reclaiming the floor as a place of pride, where experience mattered and people weren't disposable. "I'll help," he said finally, "but only if you stop budgeting safety like it's a coffee supply." Thomas chuckled dryly. "That's fair," and Walter added, "and I choose my team," thinking already of Alicia's instincts, Diego's steady hands, and Russell's unshakable grit. After the call, Walter sat back in his truck, closed his eyes for just a moment, and exhaled. Not relief, not yet, but clarity. Every piece had landed, and now it was time to rebuild. Brick by brick, bolt by bolt, starting with the people who had stayed quiet but never stopped watching. 3 days after Walter Briggs agreed to consult for Western Plains, he stepped back onto the factory floor not as a former foreman with a badge that didn't scan anymore, but as the architect of a reckoning. Jason was gone, Leonard had vanished back into some quiet corporate shuffle, and Thomas Whitfield, the new interim director from Axiom, was waiting near the break room, sleeves rolled, clip-on tie askew, looking more like a high school principal than an executive. "Walter," he greeted, voice crisp but cautious, "you've got the reins." And with that, Walter nodded once and walked straight into the belly of the plant, where the press had failed, where the people still moved like they were waiting for the next shoe to drop. He called a meeting that morning, not in a conference room, but on the floor, with every department lead standing in a circle, work gloves tucked into belts, eyebrows furrowed, hearts heavy. "We're not here to fix machines," Walter said, voice even but firm. "We're here to fix trust. Between this floor and the suits upstairs, between the work we do and the people who rely on it, not to kill them." No one clapped, no one cheered, but heads nodded, chins lifted, the silence charged with shared understanding. His first order of business was simple: restore the original safety protocols, daily inspections, mandatory maintenance windows, dual sign-off on high-risk machinery. His second was harder: reinstate Sam, the maintenance vet who'd been fired for resistance to change. Walter drove to Sam's house himself that evening, handed him the offer in person. "Come back," he said, "we're doing it right this time." And Sam, after a long pause, nodded, I'll be there Monday. Inside the plant, the shift lead started whispering that things felt different. Diego was back on diagnostics, Alicia was leading the retraining sessions, and even Russell, quiet as ever, was seen smiling in the tool room. But not everyone was happy. Jason, despite being sidelined, had friends in the corporate pipeline, and rumors started floating that Axiom would audit Walter's methods, questioning the necessity of returning to such rigorous procedures. Tomas warned him over lunch. "They're watching now, Walter, waiting for a misstep," and Walter simply replied, "Let them," because he had receipts. Memos, dates, timestamps, whistleblower files locked in triplicate across cloud storage and encrypted backups. And more than that, he had the floor behind him, the trust of people who'd seen what happened when safety became a spreadsheet column. And so, on the 12th day of his return, when a minor hydraulic fault triggered an automatic shutdown at Station 3B, no one panicked. Not the operators, not the shift lead, not Walter. Instead, they followed the newly restored procedure to the letter, isolated the fault, documented it, and had the machine back up within 4 hours without injury or incident. The next morning, Thomas handed Walter an internal memo from Axiom. "Unexpected downtime. Please advise if schedule can be accelerated via maintenance delay," and Walter, without flinching, wrote one line beneath it in blue pen: "No, but we can accelerate by doing it right the first time." That note somehow made its way to the executive Slack channel, and 2 days later, Walter received an unscheduled visit. Martin Hale, the senior partner who had greenlit Leonard's policies, arrived in a black BMW with sunglasses that cost more than Walter's entire wardrobe. They met in Thomas's office, Martin pacing like a lion smelling smoke. "Mr. Briggs, we appreciate your service, but this company cannot afford inefficiencies disguised as nostalgia." Walter folded his arms, "And we can't afford funerals disguised as cost savings." "You're just a consultant," Martin reminded. "We can end that arrangement." "You could," Walter agreed, "but the Board of Industrial Safety, the State Inspector General, and Meridian Energy, all of whom now have direct lines to me, might ask why." The silence was thick, tense, and then Walter added, voice softer but sharper, "And you'll have to explain to every widow why her husband died under lean operations." Martin didn't answer, just turned, adjusted his watch, and left. As the door shut, Thomas looked at Walter like he was seeing him for the first time. "You just said the thing we've all been thinking." Walter shook his head. "No, I just stopped pretending we couldn't say it." Outside, the sky was turning golden over the smokestacks, and Walter knew the battle wasn't won yet, but the line had been drawn. The old guard had re-entered the field, and this time he wasn't alone. Walter knew the confrontation with Martin had shifted something in the current. A fault line now ran beneath the factory, invisible but humming, waiting to crack. And he wasn't naive enough to believe this was over. Real change, he'd learned long ago, doesn't come from one victory or one raised voice. It comes from consistency, from refusing to back down even when the spotlight moves on. And so, the next day, Walter gathered the senior crew again, this time in the old maintenance bay that used to host birthday lunches before Axiom killed morale along with the party budget. He stood with the same boots he'd worn for 22 years, same flannel, sleeves rolled, voice firm. "They'll try to outweight us. They'll wait for the headlines to fade, for the next quarter to pass, for someone new to take my place." A low murmur spread, heads nodding. "So we give them no gaps," he continued. "No excuse to say we slipped. We document. We follow every protocol like it's the last shield between us and a stretcher." Alicia raised her hand. "What if they start targeting us again? Cutting hours, looking for ways to push us out quietly?" Walter looked at her. Really looked. This was the cost of betrayal. Even the strong had started bracing for backstabs. "Then they target all of us, not just one," he said, "because from now on we move as a unit." That night, Walter drafted a proposal, not to Thomas Eade, already proven an ally, but directly to Axiom HQ, a full reform plan, establish a permanent internal safety council made up of actual floor veterans, not outside hires, create a third-party audit rotation every quarter, and perhaps most controversially, tie executive bonuses to safety compliance. Not just production numbers. He titled the document Return to Integrity and submitted it through 3 channels, knowing at least one would reach someone who couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, the plant was stabilizing. Production had recovered to 93% of baseline, and quality issues had dropped to near zero in just under 4 weeks. Jason, now working under Diego, had begun to find his footing. Not as a leader, but as a learner. "I didn't know what I didn't know," he told Walter one morning, watching Alicia recalibrate a gauge by ear. Now I try to ask before I assume. Walter smiled faintly. That's the beginning of being useful. And with that, the day rolled on. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a corporate memo, but an actual letter on Western Plains letterhead, signed by the executive board. Effective immediately, we are implementing the Briggs Protocol as a pilot program across 4 of our manufacturing plants, with a view to scale company-wide by Q2. Walter read the words 3 times before leaning back in his chair, exhaling through his nose like someone who'd been holding breath for months. When he told the crew during Friday debrief, they didn't cheer, they didn't clap. They simply nodded, a quiet confirmation that maybe, just maybe, the floor would no longer be the first to bleed and the last to be asked. That weekend, Walter was invited to speak at the Regional Safety Summit in Oklahoma City, not because he was flashy or had letters after his name, but because word had spread. The old guy with the notebook, the one they tried to shove out, had outlasted them all and rebuilt something with his bare hands. Standing at the podium, his voice low and even, Walter spoke not of reforms or audits, but of people. He told them about Diego's boy in the Marines, about Alicia's insulin schedule, about Russell's night shifts to pay for his granddaughter's hearing aids. You don't protect processes, he said, eyes sweeping the room. You protect people, who give you their best years and ask for nothing but a fair day's wage and to go home with all 10 fingers. The applause was sparse but real. That night, he drove back to Tulsa, windows down, radio off, a warm Oklahoma wind brushing against memory. Back at the plant Monday morning, Walter arrived early, like always, walked the perimeter, checked every station, shook every hand, and just before the 7 o'clock a.m. bell, he gathered the day shift near the loading dock and said only this: "No one's coming to save this place but us. But now they finally see we're worth." And with that, they clocked in, tools in hand, heads high, and under the humming lights of Western Plains, something very old and very right had returned. Walter never put his name on any office door, never wore a new title on his chest, and never sat at the executive table. Yet somehow, over the next 2 months, every problem at Western Plains still found its way to him. Not because anyone told them to, but because people knew where wisdom lived. Where the floor still felt safe. He would arrive around 6:15 every morning, coffee in one hand, a worn-out binder in the other, and take the long way through the plant, nodding to the welders, exchanging quiet jokes with maintenance crews, pausing to help recalibrate a gauge if something sounded off, his steps like clockwork and his presence like gravity. Steadying, unspoken, anchoring. Jason, now humbler, had started shadowing Diego like an apprentice, learning how to listen to machines instead of simply reading metrics, and it showed. Maintenance requests were filed earlier, fewer breakdowns occurred, and more importantly, no one had been hurt in over 60 days. In the lunchroom, newer hires would glance at Walter from across the room, whispering, "That's him." While the old-timers just slid over to make space, no introductions needed. He was back. Not to take over, but to keep it all from slipping back into chaos. Thomas Whitfield, the new operations director, had once asked Walter why he refused the formal role. Director of Operational Safety and Continuity, with a full salary, benefits, and all the trimmings, and Walter had just smiled, "Because I already have the only job title that matters here, trusted." And Thomas, to his credit, understood. Once a week, Walter would still meet privately with Bethany, now head of HR, and Diego, Alicia, Russell, all part of the new safety oversight group. They'd sit around a dusty table in the old training room and go over every close call, every equipment concern, every whisper of pressure from above. This room is where the real board meets. Walter joked once, and no one laughed because it wasn't a joke. Meanwhile, the plant ran smoother than it had in years. Meridian Energy resumed full contracts. Safety violations dropped to record lows, and Axiom partners, quietly licking their wounds, kept their distance, issuing stiff policy memos but letting Tulsa run itself. Every now and then, Walter would find Russell standing alone on the catwalk above the presses, eyes on the floor, and he'd walk up beside him, hands in his pockets, say nothing for a long while, until Russell muttered, "I almost left, you know," and Walter would nod, "I know," because he almost had to. They never said thank you to each other, not out loud, but in that shared silence was everything. What surprised Walter most wasn't how quickly the plant began to heal, but how the workers themselves began to lead. The very people once ignored now carried clipboards, made recommendations, corrected junior supervisors gently but firmly, and no longer waited for permission to raise their voices. It was quiet empowerment, not flashy, no PR campaign. But you could see it in the posture of the crew, in how Diego would pause a machine mid-cycle just to recheck a calibration, and no one questioned him. They trusted him, the way they'd once trusted Walter. The shift had happened without fanfare, like a river carving stone, slow but unstoppable. One morning, as Walter walked in, he found a handwritten note tucked inside his locker. No name, just 4 words on a grease-smudged scrap of paper. "You brought us back." And he stood still for a moment, throat tightening more than he expected, because that was the only reward he ever wanted. Not a bonus, not a nameplate, but the quiet knowledge that his years had meant something, that what he built was still standing, stronger than before, because he refused to walk away when it would have been easier. And so he stayed. Not every day, not every hour, but enough to let them know he was still there, still watching, still believing in the people who kept the machines alive. And in the plant that, somehow, had become part of his bones. It started with lunch. Quiet, ordinary lunch on a Tuesday, when the break room smelled like oversalted stew and the vending machine had just eaten someone's dollar again. Walter sat at the far end, alone, like he always used to, a habit left over from years of supervising, of giving others space to vent, to be themselves, without the boss nearby. But this time, Diego plopped down beside him without asking, unwrapping a burrito the size of a small toolkit and nudging a soda in Walter's direction. "Alicia says you haven't been drinking enough water," he muttered, and Walter almost laughed. Almost, but his throat caught instead, because something about being seen that specifically, that kindly, had been missing for longer than he cared to admit. 2 minutes later, Russell joined, still wiping graphite from his knuckles, and then Alicia. Late as always, hair pulled into a haphazard bun, carrying half a salad and 2 cookies she claimed were for Walter, even though she ate both. They didn't talk about inspections or spreadsheets or safety reports that day. They talked about Diego's kid's first week at boot camp, about Alicia's nephew learning how to drive stick, about Russell's backyard grill finally falling apart. And Walter listened, chewed slowly, smiled at the right moments, said almost nothing, and when the break bell rang, he didn't leave right away. He just sat there an extra minute, looking around, wondering when exactly this place had stopped feeling like a battlefield and started to feel, quietly, like home again. After that, it became a ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday, same table, same crew, sometimes more. Even Jason dropped in once, awkward at first, but welcomed without question. Because by now, everyone understood. This wasn't a table for job titles. It was for the ones who stayed, who kept showing up even when the rules kept changing, even when they'd been pushed out and pulled back in. Someone brought Walter a coffee thermos the next week, black, with his name on it in silver marker. Just Walter. Not Mr. Briggs, not consultant, not lead anything, and he liked that more than he expected. Bethany started joining sometimes, bringing updates and small jokes, like how Thomas tried to microwave fish in the executive lounge and nearly caused an evacuation, or how the new safety protocols had been accidentally printed double-sided with last year's cafeteria menu. Walter laughed more in those lunches than he had in the last 5 years combined. Not loud, not belly laughs, but the kind that lived in his chest and stayed there all afternoon like a good hum. What struck him most, though, wasn't how he had changed, but how they had. These men and women he'd trained, coached, sometimes reprimanded, were now training each other, solving problems before they escalated, catching potential hazards he hadn't even noticed yet, and still inviting him into the conversation not because they needed him, but because they wanted him there. It was a different kind of legacy. Less about being remembered and more about being included, woven into something that kept growing without needing to be told how. And one Thursday, as Walter sat sipping from his silver-marked thermos while Alicia recited a terrible joke about torque wrenches and online dating, he felt something loosen inside. A tight knot of failure, regret, all the names he hadn't been called when they pushed him out. And it just let go. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even waiting for justice or validation. He was just here, alive, eating cookies that weren't his, surrounded by the very people whose respect couldn't be bought, only earned. And in that moment, he realized sometimes the greatest reward isn't a title or a raise or even an apology. It's a seat at the table you helped build, and the quiet joy of watching it fill up again, lunch by lunch, laugh by laugh. On a quiet Friday morning, Walter arrived half an hour before the floor lights flickered on, walking the perimeter of the factory like he used to before shift changes in the old days. Not out of duty anymore, not because someone was watching, but because that's what he did when he needed to think, when the hum of machines hadn't yet replaced the hum of memory. The main hydraulic press stood silent, still freshly oiled from the full maintenance overhaul he'd helped lead just weeks ago, and he could still hear its old cough before they replaced the gasket. The kind of thing only someone who'd known it for 20 years would notice. He paused by the west wall, where the inspection certifications now hung in a clean, newly laminated row. A quiet row of proof that what he'd fought for had stuck. No grand plaques, no speeches. But the safety board had returned, and this time they'd stayed. Reviewing. Training, rewriting policy with the new operations team that now asked before they changed things. Walter had seen the full cycle now. Not just his own fall and return, but the system slowly realigning, not because it had to, but because enough people inside had decided to care again, and that mattered more than any consultant fee or temporary contract could measure. That morning, Thomas Whitfield had called him into the office one last time, but this wasn't about inspections or consulting. It was about closure and maybe something more. "We're stabilizing faster than projected," Thomas said, handing him a folder. "Your system works. We've implemented it company-wide, and next quarter we're training regional plants the same way." Walter had nodded, not with pride, but with quiet acceptance, because deep down he'd never doubted the systems, only whether anyone would respect them once he was gone. "And this," Thomas added, sliding another envelope across the desk, "is for your time, your leadership, and your patience. Official recognition from Axiom headquarters." But Walter didn't open it, just tucked it under his arm and thanked him. It wasn't the kind of letter he needed to read to believe anymore. Walking back to his truck, he passed by the loading dock, where Russell and Diego were helping Alicia test a new barcode scanner system, and she looked up just in time to toss him a small wave. No words, just a knowing glance, like "we got it from here." And that was enough. He didn't go inside to say goodbye, didn't stop by the lunch table, didn't linger near the break room where his name still lived in half-told stories and inside jokes. He just slipped away like he'd arrived. Early, quiet, steady. The road out of the plant curved toward the west, and as he turned onto the main highway, he didn't feel like he was driving away from something, but toward something else entirely. That evening, he stopped by the river again. Same bench, same view, but this time he wasn't searching for answers. He brought a thermos, the one Alicia had marked with his name months ago, and a folder full of documents he no longer needed to reread. The sun was setting low across the water, staining everything gold like a silent thank you from the sky itself. And for the first time in years, Walter felt finished, not broken, not discarded, not invisible, just done in the best way. He didn't need to prove anyone wrong anymore. He didn't need to save the plant or his name or anyone else's reputation. He had walked through the fire, yes, but he'd done it carrying others with him, and they were still standing. At his feet, tucked just under the bench, was a new pair of work boots, untouched, still in the box, still smelling like leather and promise. He had no use for them now, but he liked having them close, like a punctuation mark on the sentence he'd spent his life writing. One final gesture, not to return, but to remember where he'd been. As the river rolled past, indifferent and eternal, Walter raised his thermos in a quiet toast. Not to victory, not to survival, but to the long, slow, patient act of doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. And in that silence, just as the first stars began to show, he whispered something only the wind could hear. Some things are worth building, even if you're not the one who gets to keep them. There comes a point in a man's life when he realizes that recognition doesn't always come in applause, or headlines, or even a thank you. Sometimes, it comes in the way a machine hums a little smoother when you're near. In the way your people walk a little taller because they remember what you taught them. And most of all, in the quiet sense that what you built didn't disappear when you walked out the door. It endured. Walter didn't set out to fight anyone. He didn't raise his voice or slam his fist. He simply did what he'd always done. He kept the records clean, the machines honest, and the people safe. And when those values were threatened, he didn't retaliate with noise. He responded with evidence, strategy, and a steady heart. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't expire when your badge stops working. It's the kind that outlives positions, departments, even titles. This story isn't just about corporate negligence or a flawed system. It's about the quiet strength of someone who refuses to look away when things start to fall apart. It's about the wisdom of those who've walked the floor long enough to hear danger in the sound of a misaligned bolt. It's about choosing to protect, not to punish. To rebuild, not to destroy. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices and the flashiest ideas, Walter reminded us of something different, that sometimes the most powerful act of leadership is silent. It is carried in the careful note-taking, in the extra 15 minutes you stay after your shift, in the way you say be careful and truly mean it. And when the system finally came back around to listen, it was his name they called. Because real change rarely comes in explosions. It comes in steady hands, consistent footsteps, and people who choose to do the right thing even when no one's looking. And maybe that's the legacy worth leaving behind. Not the title you held, but the trust you earned. Sometimes the truest power doesn't come from making noise. It comes from holding the line quietly until the noise listens. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment and share how it resonated with your own experiences. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories about quiet courage, quiet wisdom, and quiet victories, feel free to subscribe. Not because we ask, but because you feel something worth coming back for. We'll be here, quietly, always with a story worth telling.